Okay, so we have one API call finished, and now let's put it into an MVC. We don't actually need model for the countries because the model comes from the API itself, but we still need the controller and a view. So let's create a folder and I'll call it controllers. So right click Books GUI and add new folder, call it controllers. And inside I'm going to add another class and I'll call it countries controller. So as you could see, I only created a simple class here rather than a new scaffolded controller. But make sure that you call it countries controller because the word controller with the name of the class is important because the system expects it. And we can turn this into a controller very simply. We will simply inherit from controller. And of course, we need to import the namespace, which is Asp Net Core MVC. And we have our controller. So how do we access the repository? Well, that's where the dependency injection comes to play. First, we need to grab the iCountry repository interface and bring it into this class. So let's create a variable of type iCountry repository GUI, and I'll call it _ country repository. And we need to bring in the namespace, and the interface lives in bookgui.services. And in order for us to be able to use this, we simply inject it into a constructor. So let's create a constructor. And here we will pass a variable of type iCountry repository GUI, and I'll call it country repository, but without the underscore. And inside the controller, I will assign that to our _country repository. So now our variable has access to all the implementation methods for the iCountry repository GUI. So we injected the interface into the constructor, but how do we actually send it to it? How do we pass the interface into the constructor? And the answer is that we need to configure it in the startup.cs class. So let's go to our startup.cs. And here we have services that our app will be using. And one such service is the interface that we created. What we need to do here is to link it or scope it to the class that implements it. So we have iCountry repository GUI interface, and it is implemented in country repository GUI class. So all we need to do is to inject that into the services just like we injected the add MVC. So I will add another service, and we are adding the iCountry repository GUI and its implementation. So we are adding a scoped service. So I'll use the add scoped. And you can see that here we are adding a service. So the first one is going to be the interface itself. So that's iCountry repository GUI. And the second one is the implementation of that service, which is in the country repository GUI class. So with this, we injected the interface into our services. Of course, we need to grab the namespaces, so that's bookgui.services. And now the system has the service available. So let's go back to the controller. And we can now create our actions that manipulate the repository methods. So the first one, let's create index action that will simply retrieve all the countries. So I'll create a public iAction result, and I'll call it index. And it's going to be just a very short code here. All we need to do is to call the repository method getCountries and assign the result, which is the list of country DTO objects, to a variable. So let's create a variable. I'll call it countries. And here we will go to our country repository dot get countries method. And that's really it. But before we return this to a view, we want to make sure that the call didn't return empty list. So let's do an if statement. And simply go to our countries list and check the count. So if the list is empty, meaning the result returns 0 or maybe even less if something went wrong. So here, if the count of the items in the countries list is 0, then we know the list is empty. But we still want to return it even empty, but we also want to add an error into our model state, but also to our messages. For the messages, I'll use the viewBag because it's easy to use. So if the list is empty, I'm gonna create a viewBag and a property message. And here I will assign it to an error message, and it can simply say something like there was a problem retrieving countries from the database, or no country exists at all. So this is the error message that we return with the list when it's empty. And if it's not empty, or even if it is, we'll simply return it to our view. So we will return a view along with the countries list. So this is our first action, and we are now ready to display the results. So let's create the view next.